It's a pleasure to be here this evening. Thanks for the organization. Thanks, Emma. Thanks to the American Library in Paris. Thank you to Timothy Garton Ash for coming here to talk to us about his book. I thought I'd just start with a very open-ended, quick question. We don't have much time, so I want to get straight into it, and I have lots of questions. Tell us a little bit about the genesis of this book. You say it's a personal history, but it's not an autobiography. It's based on the kinds of sources that historians such as myself who write biographies use for biographies and autobiographies, i.e. journals, diaries, notebooks, sometimes even a chest, a drawer full of coins, and the things that elicit memory from the past. So I was wondering if you could start off by telling us a little bit about how this book came into being, how you thought about how you should write it.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, and it's lovely to be here in the footsteps of Hemingway and Gertrude Stein. Thomas, this book took me just 50 years to write. 50 years traveling constantly around Europe, witnessing great events, meeting major figures, but also so-called ordinary people who are, by the way, often much more extraordinary than our politicians, which isn't necessarily saying a lot. Also studying Europe in more conventional ways, like a traditional academic historian, archives, libraries, and so on, writing it all down in notebooks like this one, where I might possibly write something about this evening. And it's a very unusual genre. It's history illustrated by memoir and reportage. So it's not a classic memoir, not classic reportage, but it has large elements of that. But the stories are all there to illustrate the history and to drive the history forward. So if you like, to put it more simply, it combines the crafts of the historian and the journalist. And the way I do that is by taking the stories in the book and then crafting and looking at the history run. So for example, how do you tell the story of the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? Everybody knows that story. I tell it through my two best East German friends, Werner Kretschel and his son Joachim. Joachim, 18, angry young man, summer 1989, he escapes across the frontier from Hungary to Austria, as many people did then, gets back to West Berlin, and he thinks that he's not going to see his family in East Berlin for years and years to come. I mean, there's actually a great scene in the book, which you remember, where there was a place in East Berlin where the West Berlin City Railway, the so-called S-Bahn, went above East Berlin, such that if you stood on the street below, you could shout up to the West Berliners in this metro station in paradise, as Joachim put it to me. And so he actually went there and stood there, and they shouted to each other. And then the wall comes down. And that illustrates the really important point of what Henri Bergson called the illusions of retrospective determinism, right? The almost irresistible temptation to believe that what actually happened somehow had to happen. So we all now have fallen prey to that temptation. And so we go on. And then the day after, I get to Berlin, and I go walk through the wall, unthinkable 2 days before, across the death strip at Potsdamer Platz, and I meet a very excited East Berliner who says to me, he'd just seen an improvised poster on which was written, "Only today is the war really over." That's not just an anecdote. I would argue that for all Europeans living behind the Iron Curtain in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, only in 1989 was the war really over. And so we go on.
And we go on, and that's the halfway point in the book already. We've jumped a long way ahead, right? Because there are these sort of chronological markers, the 1945, the fall of the wall, and then we get up to the present. But I want to pause there for a second.
You're an orderly historian. You want chronology here. Yes.
Well, I want to scramble this a little bit, and I want to keep my questions very brief, because as you've just gathered, one of the beautiful things about the book is the way in which Timothy manages to weave together these personal stories together with the larger picture, the larger frame picture, and give us a sense of a living history, an experienced history. And it's really a skill. It's really and I think it's really the way in which you bring history back to life. You just alluded to one of the things that I found really most fascinating about doing this kind of sort of caméra embarquée, sort of embedded journalist sort of way of doing history, which is to show to readers today just how things looked differently back then, how they weren't necessarily going to lead to where we are now, right? There wasn't this inevitability. You show how contingent things were and how things have changed. So in the mid-1970s, for example, nobody expected the Cold War to end, right? You make a big point of that, of trying to get us to remember a time or understand that there was a time when it wasn't a foregone conclusion that the Berlin Wall would come down, that the Cold War would come to an end. And in fact, if anything, in the mid-70s, it seemed as if the Soviet Union might win the Cold War. And so this question of historical perspective is really important. And by doing history this way, I feel as if you managed to show us the contingency and the brittleness almost of...
Both, I mean, 2 points on that. First of all, you know, there are many things that conventional academic historians know better. They have more of the sources, they have the secret documents if they exist and they have access to them, and above all, they know some of the longer-term consequences. But one of the things they cannot recover, apart from the sense of what it felt like to be there, is what people didn't know at the time, right? So, you know, that is one of the essential things to understanding this. We didn't know how the story was going to proceed at any point. And so in a sense, reading history is rather like watching a football match, or indeed an American football match, if you like that kind of thing, on replay on TV when you know the result, right? It's not the same. The excitement is gone. But the other thing is that 1989 in particular was a 1 in a million example of historical luck, what Machiavelli called fortuna. So many different things had to come together, right? Gorbachev and the East European dissidents with their model about how you make evolutionary change in Eastern Europe, seizing the opportunity that Gorbachev had given, West German détente policy, and Reagan, actually, and US policy also. And then even on the day, if you take just the day of the fall of the Berlin Wall, there were at least 3 points where luck played a huge part. And the great mistake, because this book is also about, it's a book of liberal self-criticism. It's about the mistakes that we liberals, Western European liberals, made. And the mistake, one of the biggest mistakes we made was to take this thing, which was a 1 in a million example of historical luck, and to turn it into history with a capital H, in the Hegelian sense, an inevitable process of progress towards the spread of freedom. And just when we started making that mistake, things started going wrong.
We'll get there. We are there.
We're still there,
We're still there, unfortunately, yes.
And not just in Europe, if I may say so. Yeah.
Another thing that appears very clearly in that moment and in other moments, sort of key events, is not just the sort of the contingency and the luck, the paths not taken, so to say, but also the role of individuals, right? So you mentioned before, right, this is in part a book about the small lives, the everyday people, but there are also some of these sort of world historical figures, if we want to sort of use Hegelian language, and you seem to want to suggest that some of them sort of stand out, and really we should sort of learn from them. I mean, I'm thinking of Gorbachev, of course. I'm thinking of Václav Havel, for example, and some other figures. So can you tell us a little bit? I mean, it's not a book about the great men of Europe, but they do seem to play an important role nonetheless. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So, a year after that extraordinary few days in Berlin, I'm sitting in the office of Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of the Federal Republic who just united Germany. Anyone here actually seen Helmut Kohl? Hands up, anyone who's seen Helmut Kohl? Well, several people here I can see. Well, I hope you'll agree with me. He was the largest human being I have ever seen, both in height and in girth. He was what Dr. Johnson called a mountenance man. And there he is, towering, we're sitting like this, and he's towering over me in his office still in Bonn. And suddenly he says, by the way, do you realize you're sitting opposite the direct successor to Adolf Hitler?
That's one of those moments in the book where you...
Well, conversation stop if ever I heard one. What does one say? If I'd been quick enough, what I should have said is, actually, Herr Bundeskanzler, there was great Admiral Dönitz between Hitler and you, because those of you who know your German history know that Grand Admiral Dönitz was for a few days ahead of... His point being, but actually, this tells you Kohl's real sense of history. I mean, he was telling me that for a very serious reason. I'm deeply conscious of my historical responsibility as, in effect, the first Chancellor of a united Germany since Adolf Hitler, and I'm going to do everything differently. Hitler tried to put a German roof over Europe. I'm going to put a European roof over Germany, which, by the way, he did in large measure. And the European Union we have today is, to a significant degree, a result of Helmut Kohl's determination to do just that. So there's one example of a major figure. Gorbachev, obviously. I have to say I was hugely critical of Reagan at the time, but Reagan's switch from the ultimate Cold Warrior, the arms race against the Soviet Union in his first term, to being the ultimate détente politician, even peacenik, going far too far for Margaret Thatcher in his second term, is another example. And again, all those three came together in this extraordinary moment. And of course, in one of the true heroes of the book is Václav Havel, who for me is just really perhaps the greatest European of my life, anyway.
And Bronislaw Geremek, perhaps.
And Bronislaw Geremek, who indeed we were talking about with Polish friends last night, because I'm actually toying with the idea of writing a short book about Geremek. So for those of you who don't know, very quickly, Bronislaw Geremek is one of the most extraordinary life stories in 20th century Europe. Grew up as a Jewish child in pre-1939 Warsaw, survived the Warsaw Ghetto, escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto, brought up by a stepfather, briefly had a sort of Christian passage, then a communist, a magnificent medieval historian, very closely connected with France, spent many years in Paris, then became a key advisor to the Solidarność movement in Poland, the Solidarity movement, was in effect one of the intellectual architects of the Polish Round Table, which was a key to the peaceful revolutions of 1989, a pioneering part of that story, and then became a Polish politician who actually signed his country into membership of NATO and saw it into the EU. I mean, quite extraordinary. So that life, in a way, has almost every dimension of the European 20th century.
Indeed. And as it cuts through, it leads me to my sort of last preliminary question, because it is a book about sort of episodes and moments and key sort of moments in your life too, and in the life which largely intersects with the life of Europe since the post-war and certainly the 1970s. But one thing that cuts through all of this, apart from these figures whose lives you follow, is this idea of memory, right? And you talk about the memory engine. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the importance of memory. Obviously, we're all familiar with the role of memory in with regard to the Holocaust, for example. But you almost want to make an argument about its importance to Europe, to the purpose of Europe, the future of Europe. And so, yeah, the memory engine, it pops up again and again in the book.
So I argue in the book that the Europe we have today is made essentially by 4 generations of Europeans, each shaped by formative experiences in their youth. The 14ers, those shaped by the experience of the First World War, de Gaulle, Adenauer, Churchill, de Gasperi. the 39ers, a very big generation shaped by their experience of the Second World War, the 68ers, 68, very important, and then the 89ers, those who experienced the great events of 1989 when they were young. And in each case, this created what I call the memory engine, which drove their commitment to a certain idea of Europe throughout their lives, for all their lives. The problem comes when you've had 35 years of a Europe which for most Europeans has been a Europe of relative peace, freedom, prosperity, security. You have none of these great, deep, formative experiences. So, as it were, where's the memory engine? And in fact, I'm sure your students, and certainly my students at Oxford, on the whole, until very recently, until maybe the war in Ukraine, tended to take that for granted, because that was normal. Historically speaking, it is profoundly abnormal. The Europe we've had for the last 30 years, in historical perspective, is hugely abnormal, but they think it's normal. So then the question is, can we learn from the past without going through it ourselves? Which is, of course, what we historians try to do, usually in vain.
Right, I'm glad I don't have that job of having to figure that out. How do we avoid that? But the book is called Homelands, and in a way, that's almost, I don't want to say an oxymoron, but there's something about, typically people think of themselves as having one homeland, and so obviously there's a point here with the plural, the S. Many of its translations are actually Europe, which is an interesting editorial choice in some languages. I can't remember which ones, but the ones I've seen, there's some that are Europe. And you talk about many Europes in the book. There's a whole chapter that kind of brushes the sort of different ways of thinking about Europe. And so Europe is plural. Your home is plural. It's homelands. The book decenters Europe in a way. I'm a historian of France primarily, and so I tend to think of Europe as being somewhere around Paris.
I think you're somehow not alone in that. I think you have a few million people in France who...
I'm not alone, but this was very good as a corrective for me, reminding me that actually there's a lot going on further east, or not east, but just central, right? That's where the center of Europe actually is, and your whole career has been in part sort of helping us Western European historians correct that kind of bias towards the West. You talk of a kaleido tapestry, right, where individual nations kind of both find themselves in translation but also lose themselves in translation. Translation becomes this key operational word to sort of keep these different nations somehow glued together. But so can you, and then that raises the what you call the Roman question, right? The question of unity versus diversity within an empire. And Europe is in a way an empire. You say it yourself. So can you walk us through a little bit this sort of variety of Europes, these different homelands that constitute this continent/empire that is Europe? It's a big topic.
Thomas, I think you've packed about 4 different questions into that one question.
I'm conscious of time.
Okay, I'll be as quick as I can. By the way, on that slight tendency sometimes of the French to equate themselves with Europe, near the D-Day beaches where my father landed with the first wave on D-Day, which is how the book starts and ends. I think it's at Homelands. There's a sign which says, ici le 6 juin 1944, les Alliés libérons l'Europe. Hang on a second. If you were sitting in Warsaw or Budapest, you would say, I didn't notice that Europe had been liberated, but, they've liberated France, so they've liberated Europe. But listen, homelands. For me, I put this to you in the audience. Have a think about this. If you were asked the question, what is the most sort of characteristic thing about being a European, if you are a European? I would say it's this unique experience of being at home abroad, right? So I'm in Paris today, I'm in Berlin next month, I'm in Warsaw, I'm in Prague. I know I'm abroad, but yet I'm also at home as a European. And I'm not sure, I mean, we might want to discuss actually whether Americans have quite the same experience anywhere else. Certainly there's no other continent where you have 40 countries where you can feel at home abroad. So, right? So it's homelands in the plural. So it's neither there's only one fatherland or patrie or homeland, the nationalist position, but nor is it what people used to say with over-heavy pathos, that Europe is my homeland singular. Europe is my country, right? There are very few people who feel that. And that goes to your point about unity and diversity, which is this. Ever since the gradual decline of the Roman Empire, because it didn't actually fall, it just gradually declined, we Europeans have been going to and fro between two kind of temptations. One is to try to recreate the Roman Empire, which starts almost as soon as that empire has declined. So Theodoric the Goth in the 6th century is already doing it. Then, of course, Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire. Then Napoleon. It's no accident. The Treaty of Rome. No accident, it's the Treaty of Rome that founds what's now the European Union. So that's one thing, trying to recreate Rome. The other is what the Stanford historian calls the escape from Rome. There's a very fine book, Walter Scheidel, The Escape from Rome, which is, this is getting too tight for us. Let's do a Brexit, right? Let's get out of this. And it's not just the Brits who have these temptations from time to time. Viktor Orban would have the same feeling, and Marine Le Pen too. And so it's this constant to and fro between trying to recreate Rome and escape from Rome. And the conclusion to draw from that is, the object is not simply unity, the United States of Europe, Europe as one homeland, nor is it simply diversity. Let's have 40 sovereign nation states and we'll all be fine. It's to find that really elusive mixture between unity and diversity. And for me, that's a really important message for the leaders of the EU and people in Brussels, because their inclination is always to think, more Europe, more Europe, more Europe, we have more and more unity. No, what we're about, particularly in an enlarged Europe, is trying to find this right balance between unity and diversity.
Do you think the euro was going too fast, was too much pushing towards this unity?
So I thought that at the time, and I think if I were Greek, and I'd seen my economy shrink by 25%, and the terrible suffering that was imposed on Greece, I would worry about that. I mean, clearly, it was to have a monetary union without a fiscal union with such a diverse group of economies was, to put it mildly, it was not an optimal currency area. It was a political project. Having said that, you know, I have to say, the fact that one can travel all over Europe with just one currency in your pocket, I mean, it's become one of those symbols of European identity, I think. So, you know, but of course, what you need now to make it work, as we're seeing, is actually a degree of political unity, which many Europeans, including Helmut Kohl's people, the Germans, are no longer so keen on.
So this actually leads me to 2 points I want to push you a little bit on. You say my Europe is a struggle for freedom, and we're all for freedom, that's great. But Europe itself is a moving target. It's a historical object, right, that has changed. And the first part of the book, we'll get back to chronology at the end, but the first part of the book, which is sort of goes up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War. Europe is this beacon of hope and promise of democracy, and the book brings us through pages of history that even I sort of had forgotten about, sort of the fall of dictatorships, of fascist dictatorships in Spain, in Portugal, which is not that long ago, but it's a good reminder that it's happening still in the 70s. And obviously for Eastern Europe, Eastern European countries, Europe is this beacon of hope and freedom. Fast forward to sort of maybe 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it doesn't look quite the same way, right? The Europe of today is often perceived as a sort of technocratic, removed, sort of apparatchik Brussels. There's the metonym that sort of stands in for everything. And I myself, I'm born British, but I've always thought I would die with a European passport. And then I started thinking maybe my children would die with a European passport. And then after Greece, which you brought up, I started thinking, well, do I want my children to die with a European passport? And so I still feel very European at heart, but certainly my perception of what Europe is and stands for has shifted. And I think I'm not the only one. And so how do we deal with this fact that Europe is no longer today, for lots of people, that beacon of freedom and democracy that it clearly was and worked out to be for so many before, in the second half of the 20th century?
So what I say in the book is Europe, my Europe, is the Europe of freedom. So those are the two leitmotifs of my own life's work, Europe and freedom. There are almost as many Europes as there are Europeans. So the people have different Europes, but that's my Europe. And seen from that point of view, look, when I first started traveling to continental Europe as a young man in the early 1970s, Europe was a continent of dictatorships. We did the math. 289 million Europeans living under democracies, 389 million Europeans living under dictatorships, not just the whole of Eastern and Southeastern Europe, Spain, Portugal, and Greece, all still right-wing dictatorships. It was a Europe of dictatorships. If you told that to a young European today, they'd be very surprised indeed, unless they'd taken your courses at Columbia, I'm sure. And so from that point on, early to mid-1970s, starting with the transition in Spain, Portugal, and Greece, you have this kind of gradual ascending curve in the spread of Europe and freedom and democracy, all marching together. So for example, we had a conference at Oxford with great figures of the Polish transition and the Spanish transition, right? One from a fascist dictatorship, one from a communist dictatorship, and for both of them, Europe and democracy of these twin causes, they went together. And that goes all the way through to the big eastward enlargement of the European Union, 2004, 2007. Starting 2008 with the global financial crisis on the one hand and Putin's seizure of two great chunks of Georgia on the other, Europe goes into this cascade of crises, and actually which we're still in. I mean, Euro crisis, refugee crisis, seizure of Crimea and eastern Ukraine, Brexit, populism, Marine Le Pen, Trump first term, COVID, all the way to the 24th of February 2022 and the war in Ukraine. So that you have this absolute cascade of crises which leads, according to some recent polling which my Oxford research project did with ECFR, close to 1/3 of Europeans thinking the European Union is quite likely to fall apart in the next 20 years. So there's an absolute crisis of confidence inside the European Union. But one thing hasn't changed. Those outside really believe in it. So if you want to get your faith in Europe back, go to Ukraine. Just take a train from Przemysl. I've been to Ukraine 4 times since the beginning of the full-scale war. It's just inspiring. Every second word is Europe. And of course in Southeast Europe and so on. So those outside still very much, I think, believe in Europe as a place of freedom. But the doubts, I think, are coming from inside.
So you've set up 2 further questions that I had. One, we'll get to Ukraine.
By the way, Thomas told me beforehand he has 400 questions. I just warned you.
We're getting through quite a few. The other sort of complication, I think, with the Europe of today, and you've just sort of mentioned it in a way, is the people outside who want to come in. And the throughout the book, at various moments, you seem to suggest, or at least that's the way I read it, that the question of immigration, diversity, Islam in Europe, integration, terrorism, all of these themes that are often sort of threaded together in political discourse today, pose some of the more challenging issues that you've confronted, both as a scholar, as a journalist, as a European, trying to make sense of what's happening. And I'm going to put it a little bit forcefully, but I think the point is interesting to think with. Is the condition for freedom of movement in Europe having walls around it?
You haven't put it too forcefully at all. I would put it even more strongly. So one of the things I do in the book, because as you know, I like to go and see for myself, is to go to a little Spanish enclave called Ceuta. I don't know if one or two of you know. Ceuta is a tiny, it's actually the oldest European colony on the African mainland, originally Portuguese since 1415. But it's a tiny little bit of Europe, as it were, carved out of Morocco, very close to the Straits of Gibraltar. And 35 years ago, people could just walk across the frontier. I mean, there was a notional frontier, but there was nothing there. And step by step, as we have moved the barriers inside the European Union, they built a fence, they built a larger fence. Now it's well over 6 meters tall. Actually, it's a double fence with barbed wire and searchlights and sensors and raked sand and a special road for military vehicles. And you know what? It looks exactly like the Iron Curtain. I've seen them both. And that gives you a picture of the direct causal connection, the way in which more freedom of movement for us inside the European Union means less for people coming from outside. And I actually met some kids from Morocco who'd got across, some refugees, very moving encounters. They were, I mean, you could see in their eyes that they could turn into, fantastic assets for Europe, entrepreneurs. I mean, there's tremendous motivation to make their lives. Or if we didn't let them, they'd be very angry indeed. And at one point I said to them, tell me, you've told me everything that's so great about Europe. What's the worst thing about Europe? And there was a long pause, and then one of them said, being sent back to Morocco. That's the worst thing about Europe. So we have these millions of people who want to come to us. If we don't control immigration, Marine Le Pen will undoubtedly be the next president of France. And the AfD could win the German elections, and I mean, our politics will go much further right than they are at the moment, so we have to manage that immigration, but we have to do it by legal and humane means. And that's very, very difficult to do, to square that circle.
A complicated issue, as you gather. We have only a few more minutes before opening it up to the rest of the audience. So I want to touch on some of the other amazing sort of the range of topics covered in this book is extraordinary, and so it's very difficult to cover it all in 45 minutes. But one of the other things that I found really interesting is the hubris. There's a chapter called Hubris, I think, and this sort of sense of we've won it, right? History's over, or we've won history, or whatever, in the 90s and early 2000s. And you bring John Stuart Mill into the equation, and with the wonderful thing that Mill says, which is that you need the opponent, right? You need the opposing opinion to remind yourself that why your one is right and correct. And there was this sense in the late 90s that there was no longer an opposition, there was no longer an alternative, right? And so history had sort of come to an end. How wrong we were, right? And that paves the way to populism, but also, and this is what brings us perhaps to Ukraine, that it's not entirely clear, I think, in the book. Was there an agreement? Was there not an agreement for Europe to not expand eastwards, to not encroach on the former sphere of influence of the Soviet Union? Was there a missed opportunity there in the 90s to settle a kind of coexistence between NATO and Russia, or what was left of the Soviet Union?
I mean, just on hubris, this goes back to the thing I was saying at the beginning about kind of confusing history with a small h, how history actually happens with history with a big H. So some of you will have thought Fukuyama, end of history, and all of that. Actually, in the early 1990s, the Fukuyama moment, we were very uncertain how things were going to turn out, right? I mean, and I have friends here in this room, none of us knew whether you could make actually the transition from a communist system to a liberal democracy and to a free market economy. The joke at the time was, we know you can turn an aquarium into fish soup. Can you turn fish soup back into an aquarium? And it was actually, and by the way, most of the big European projects had not been completed. I mean, no single market, no single currency, no enlargement, and it's no European Central Bank. And I think, Thomas, it's actually not in the 90s. I think it's in the early to mid 2000s when, to coin a phrase, we said, and I plead guilty myself, mission accomplished. Remember that phrase, mission accomplished?
Yep.
And it was, of course, that's precisely the moment when things started going wrong. And it's no accident that the crisis cascade starts immediately after that. As for missed opportunities, look, you can always find things we could have done better. But my broad answer to you is no. We actually made major efforts to bring Russia into the Western liberal international order. We did try to help Russia modernize and democratize, particularly the Clinton administration, but also Germany in the 1990s. For heaven's sake, we took them into the top table of the West. G7 became G8. And actually, I document in the book, don't let anyone tell you NATO enlargement is the cause of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. I met Vladimir Putin in 1994, deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. No one had ever heard of this guy.
Wonderful description of him.
Lots of rather unpleasant-looking little man with a vaguely rat-like face. Some kind of sidekick of the man. Nobody had any idea who this guy was. And then at the end of this very friendly conference in St. Petersburg, full of goodwill, he suddenly pipes up and says, I have to tell you, we have to remember there are territories that were historically always Russian, untrue of course, which are now outside the Russian Federation, and we have a duty to look after them. And he mentioned Crimea, 1994. And he said there are 25 million Russians who are now outside the Russian Federation, and we have to look after them. Don't tell me that the eastward enlargement of NATO, which only started 5 years later, is the cause of his invasion of Ukraine. The basic revanchist instinct was, I think, there. So obviously there are things you could have done differently. One of them is, if you remember, 2008, crucial year, Bucharest summit of NATO. The Bush administration wants to start Ukraine on what was called a membership action plan, which is a path to membership of NATO. Angela Merkel, people always say Germany and France, actually basically it was Germany, said no way at all. Compromise formulation in the concluding communique. Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, but we're not actually going to do anything about it. And that was precisely the worst of both worlds, because it enhanced Putin's sense of threat. NATO is coming to my front door, without giving Ukraine any more security. So, with benefit of hindsight, I tend to think now we should have done what the Bush administration proposed. And imagine, and by the way, imagine, if I may quickly, imagine if we'd had a stronger reaction to 2014. Right? 2008 is Georgia, but 2014. Imagine if, in response to this extraordinary, outrageous thing, simply seizing a chunk of a neighboring country's sovereign territory, we had imposed much tougher sanctions. We didn't, they weren't major sanctions on Russia at that time. gone after the dirty Russian money which is swilling around many Western cities, notably London, Londongrad, as they call it, given more military support to Ukraine at that time, started them on this path to genuine security, reduced our energy dependence on Russia, in the case, for example, of Germany, instead of increasing it, and sent a much clearer signal to Putin. I mean, as you know, as a historian, we can play with these what-if questions. We never know what would have happened if, but it's at least arguable we wouldn't be in the mess we're in today.
Right. As you've just gathered, the book ends on the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and I think you want to make that a date in terms of the key dates that break up the sequence of the post-war. This is the next turning point, right? And it almost eclipses 9/11, the American 9/11, I almost want to say.
I think fascinatingly, it totally eclipses it. So, of course, events like buildings look much bigger when you're closer to them, and then you have to get a bit of a distance away. If you remember, all our front pages said 9/11 changes everything, right? It is the great world historical turning point. Now, it changed a hell of a lot in the Middle East. It changed a hell of a lot in the United States, and therefore, of course, that impacts us. But I argue that it wasn't the big turning point in European history. I think the turning point in European history is the 24th of February 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I mean, there's a kind of sub-turning point around 2008 when you get that downward turn. And so, you know, a great friend and wonderful historian of Europe based at NYU, Tony Jart, famously wrote a terrific book on post-1945 Europe, which is called Post-War. And what I argue is that as well as the post-war period, there is this period that I call post-wall. Starts on the 9th of November 1989, ends on the 24th of February 2022. And so that bookends that whole period. And of course, the corollary of that is that we're in a new period of European history. And beginnings really matter. They matter more, right? So what was done in 1946 or 48 matters a lot more than what was done in 1958, because it shapes everything that follows, you know, as in life too. So that's why I think just as the years post-45 were absolutely formative, and those post-89 were in another of these crucible periods, sort of present to the creation.
And I should say the book ends on a tone which is summed up with the famous phrase by Romain Rolland: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So it's not. It is a return to a kind of dark continent, to use our common friend Mark Mazauer's book title for the first half of the 20th century, but one that should not lead to a Zweigisch sort of pessimism, a sense of end of the world, right? While people prepare their first question, I'm just going to slip in one very last one, because we can't, we can't not talk. We're both British, at least by birth.
Oh gosh, you want to depress me now, really.
And of course there is a chapter on Brexit in the book. It's one of the more kind of intimate, I almost want to say, chapters. And I should have said before, I forgot that the book is bookended by your father, Dad, which is also a very touching, poignant sort of moment at the beginning and at the end of the book. But Brexit is really also a chapter where you feel the hurt, you feel the pain, the nostalgia for that moment of cool Britannia, which I remember very well. I was a student in the 90s, New Labour. It was an exciting time to be in London, and that goes almost the swan song for it is the Olympics, the 2012 Olympics, which you go over, and it brought a sense of nostalgia to me, I must say. And then there's the shame, the embarrassment, the sort of the sense of befuddlement almost of Brexit, and I feel we're still sort of coping with it, right? We're still sort of trying to get over it.
Tell me about it. Sure, we don't want to talk about something else. Biggest political defeat of my life. By the way, like the fall of the Berlin Wall, the great good news, anything but inevitable. I mean, that was a 1 in a million example of historical good luck. So many things had to come together to make this happen. Don't let anyone tell you it was inevitable. It wasn't. And we threw it all away. I mean, you know, Britain circa 2010 was in such a good position, wasn't it? It was a country with a great sense of its history, but had modernized. That was sort of symbolized in the London Olympics. You remember those mixed of old and new. It had fantastic relations with the Anglosphere, but also with Europe. We were in Europe, and then we'd kind of escaped the post-imperial trap. This, for me, is a key point. You know, that it's very, very difficult when you've lost an empire, how you adapt to that. And if we'd been talking in 2010, I'd have thought we'd succeeded, actually. We'd done something that doesn't often happen in history. We'd escaped the post-imperial trap. And then I'll tell you what I compare it to. You forgive this, it's a slightly childish comparison, but like many people here, my children have forced me to watch the Lord of the Rings films many times. And do you remember that moment when they go under the mountain with Gandalf and there's some horrible monster emerging from the deep called sort of Brobdingnag or something like that? I don't remember. And Gandalf fights him with all his wizardish powers, and he's defeated him. Do you remember this? I see you know your Lord of the Rings. And then at the last minute, when the Brobdingnag is thoroughly defeated, one little sort of lash of his tail comes up and pulls Gandalf down. And that's my image for what happened to Britain. We'd almost escaped. We'd defeated the Brobdingnag of, you know, the post-imperial trap, and then suddenly we were pulled down. And the consequences, Thomas, which are being played out today, not just the economic ones, which we all know about and which are very well documented, but the loss of international reputation, attractiveness, and influence inside the EU. Nobody talks about Britain anymore. French and German, Spanish and Portuguese meet. Nobody talks about Britain anymore. I talked to a very senior American diplomat, and I said, how much less important is Britain to the United States after Brexit? And he looked at me and said, much less important, much less important. So, I mean, the cost is going to be paid over years and decades. And if somebody asks me, I'll tell you what I think are the chances of us coming back.
Well, there you have your first question, but let me open it up to the audience, please.
Can we have a round of
Emily.
applause, please? Thank you both so much for this incredible discussion. It's been such a pleasure to sit here and learn from you and commiserate with you. I'll stop wasting the audience's time now, so raise your hands very high and I'll come to you, and if we have time, we'll turn to Zoom as well.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the book. My question was piqued from the discussion around the euro. And I guess what I'm hearing, or what I heard that struck my opinion, was this idea that what's wonderful about Europe is feeling home abroad. What's nice about the euro is that we can take the same change to different country. But I guess I'm struck by those, I mean, as you describe the voters of Brexit as a Balrog, essentially, but my question is, how do we bring this feeling to those of us who haven't experienced that in Europe? How do we do it? Is it fiscal union, political union? Where do we go from here?
First of all, I couldn't agree more. One of the many examples of hubris was that we liberal Europeans spent all our time thinking about the other half of the world and not enough about the other half of our own societies. And Brexit was the revenge of the other half of Britain, who were saying, here we are, we need to be heard. As in Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, attention must be paid. You remember that great line? Attention must be paid. That's what the voters in the north of England were saying. So I couldn't agree more. And actually, the only good idea to be associated with Brexit, although it didn't come out of Brexit, is what in Britain is called levelling up. addressing those problems. But the irony of Brexit is that Brexit means we don't have the money to pay for levelling up, so it's not going to happen. But I mean, the idea, I think, in France too, in all our societies, is absolutely central. Now, of course, the Euro bit of that is that, and I quote in the book a terrific British economist who very early in the 1980s said, if you do just a currency union, the rich bits of Europe are going to get richer, and the poorer bits of Europe are going to get poorer. Spot on. Exactly what's happened. So you can't just do a currency union. You've got to have the financial transfers as you have inside the United States, from state to state, and the policy mix to ensure that it's not winners and losers in that dramatic way. Now, of course, the irony of this story is that it took another 5 crises before the Eurozone started doing that. And the so-called next generation EU, the 750 now 800 billion euro funding, of which Italy alone has got more than 200 billion, which was ostensibly a response to COVID, but it's mutualized European debt, and half of it is simply grants, not loans, is actually the right answer to the Eurozone crisis, just coming 10 years later.
Hi, I'm a child of 89. I'm Polish and British, so I wanted to say thank you for mentioning Professor Geremek, and please, please, please write your book and bring his story to people worldwide. But my question is, I've got children. I'm becoming very pessimist. I'm married to a Frenchman who's Eurosceptic. I feel that you were touching on something very important, saying it was a unique moment in history, was this huge element of chance. Do you feel we still have the time? Because we had a 30-35 period of long peace. We took it for granted. There was hubris. It feels like now it's nemesis. The old empires in the East are back with Russia and China. America is withdrawing. We have our unity and diversity, but no hard power to go behind it and defend what's dear to us. And we seem to be losing the will.
So if we don't find a really strong European response to the triple challenge of all those kinds of crises we were just talking about a moment ago, Putin's horrendous war on Ukraine, and the, I'm sorry to say, more than 50% now probability of Donald Trump becoming the next president of the United States. I don't want to depress you even further. But even if you're going to put the probability lower, there's a very significant probability, and we have to prepare for it now. So I would say it's not too late, but it is 5 minutes to 12. And the decisions we make this year, in the next 12 months, will be crucial. One of the big ones is, listen, the Ukrainian armed forces are running out of ammunition, right? They're seriously running out of ammunition, and therefore they're getting killed. They're getting hammered. We promised them, as the EU, I still say we, the EU, 1 million rounds of ammunition by March. At the end of December, we'd only given them 300,000. So, Emmanuel Macron talks about a war economy, but he only talks about a war economy. We actually need to do it, to build up our defense industry, to get the weapons, send the German Taurus missiles to Ukraine, and help Ukraine to victory. That's one big thing we can do right now. And prepare so that if, which God forbid, Donald Trump is the next president of the United States, we have something to say to him. We are able to say Europe is actually doing a great deal more for its own defense. So I don't think it's too late. Don't despair, but we better get on with it.
Just to mention one quite nice thing that I think happened in the last couple of days is that the Spanish government have now said that the Spanish courts have said it's illegal to send back underage Moroccans who've come over from Ceuta. So they're actually trying to keep that door open for underage, for minors. They've said it's not legal to be sending them back, which they had been doing.
Yeah.
But my other point, I'm really as pessimistic as the lady at the back. I'm Scottish, and we voted against Brexit, by the way, as you know.
So did we.
Yeah. My question really is going back to your point about memory and the generations of memory. And I guess my concern, which I think the previous questioner suggested as well, is that we're actually losing that sense of the memory of Europe. And I'm thinking of the kinds of things that we're reading now about the fragmented electorates. If you look at Fouquet, I think, what has he got, 8 different electorates or 7 different electorates in France, that people are organizing themselves or arraigning themselves against issues. We've got what's going on as we speak with agriculturalists in France, which is a European movement which is very much against the slowness of the European bureaucracy to help agricultural workers, and they're just one set of people. So I guess my question is, this kind of creeping skepticism and fragmentation, is that destroying the will to maintain Europe?
Yeah, so look, I mean, first of all, you know, on the short list of what we need to do this year, centre-right and to a lesser extent centre-left politicians need to stop blowing wind into the sails of the hard right, of the populists, right? The more you say, stop the boats, send them back, the more you focus in slightly hysterical fashion on immigration, the more you're sending voters to the hard right. And actually, there's very good evidence on this. I mean, a colleague of mine at Oxford has done a big study on this. I mean, it is demonstrably the case, and I'm afraid Macron is now making the same mistake. What you need to do is actually to have an effective managed migration policy, but a completely different rhetoric. A rhetoric of calm, I don't want to say la force tranquille, but a rhetoric of calm, and actually explaining why managed migration is very good for our societies and why they need it. So that's point number one, the migration point. I think your fragmentation point is really crucial, because that's happening across the board in European politics. The Dutch elections, I think there were 20 parties, I think there are now 16 in the parliament. Germany, you know, apart from its paralysis through its institutional checks and balances, has this totally malfunctioning coalition, which is again strengthening support for the AfD. But that, of course, is a much more difficult one to address, because that fragmentation is an expression of democratic choices. I mean, you're giving people choices, and people no longer want just 2 big parties. So I think that's a really difficult one. By the way, just last quick sentence. Crucial to all this is Germany. Absolutely crucial to all this is Germany. The lack of strategic leadership from Germany, apart from the one word Zeitenwende, is becoming a huge European problem.
Can we have a final round of applause, please?